Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Carnegie Council. We're delighted to have today as a guest Michael Manelbaum. Michael is the Christian A. Herter Professor of American Foreign Policy and Director of the American Foreign Policy Program at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies in Washington. He's also a former faculty member at Harvard University, Columbia University, and the U.S. Naval Academy. In addition to being an old friend, I can honestly say that while the term Renaissance man is way overused, it is hardly so in the case of Michael. His book today is one of a series of forceful contributions to the writing on American foreign policy. But he has also written on the meaning of sports, why Americans watch baseball, football, and basketball, and what they see when they do, which I would urge you to look as a bookend to this piece, The Frugal Superpower. We will be talking about the book in the following way. First of all, Michael and I will have a conversation of some 15 to 20 minutes, just exploring the contours of the book and the main themes. And then we'll throw it open to the audience for the next half hour to 35 minutes or so on and so forth. So Michael, again, welcome to the Council.
A pleasure to be with you. Thank you for inviting me.
To get right to the heart of the matter, Michael, it seems that to me the book has three themes. Tell me if I'm correct. First, that there's a perfect storm, as it were, of the fallout from the financial crisis of '08, the soaring deficits, federal deficit, and the equally rapidly rising so-called entitlement program costs of Social Security and Medicare, and that these three factors will inevitably lead to a more constrained U.S. international engagement. Second, this does not mean that there will be a new era of isolationism for the U.S. As you say at one point, no country stands ready to replace the USA, which will remain economically and militarily preeminent for the foreseeable future, but rather that we'll pick and choose our obligations more selectively, more judiciously, taking into account political threats and competitors along the way. And you mentioned particularly China, Russia, and Iran. And third, that it is incumbent upon the United States to forge a new policy focused on a reduction in our dependence on foreign oil, whose implications and importance this policy is no less than the policy of containment of the Soviet Union in the latter part of the last century. In reading the book and admiring what you say, it's a long way from in praise of Goliath a mere 4 years ago, but tell me if my analysis is correct.
I couldn't have said it better myself. I hope I said it at least as well. That's a very concise summary of the major points. I would emphasize on the first point that while the deficits that were run up between 2001 and 2007 are pretty formidable, and the amount of money that we are throwing at the financial meltdown and the recession that it dramatically worsened are formidable, the real challenge, the real tidal wave of economic obligations comes from the entitlement programs because of the retirement of the baby boom generation, that is those Americans born between 1946 and 1964. There are almost 80 million of us, and as we begin to collect benefits, the bill that the government, which is to say all of us, will have to pay, will zoom upward. This is really quite unprecedented. Now, we have gotten into the habit of spending more than we collect in taxes and bridging the gap by borrowing increasingly from abroad and from foreign governments, but the increase in obligations is going to be so dramatic in the next couple of decades that it's simply not going to be possible to borrow all the money that we'll need. And that means that we won't be able to avoid, no matter what our politicians promise us, both raising taxes and cutting benefits. And raising taxes for everybody, not just the rich, and cutting benefits where it really matters, Social Security and Medicare. And that, I believe, will create a new and different and not entirely pleasant political climate in the country, in which many of the familiar landmarks and signposts of American public policy will certainly be challenged and maybe toppled, and foreign policy will certainly not be accepted in the kind of economic and political climate that I foresee, principally, although not exclusively, because of the costs of boomer retirement. People, I think, are going to be a lot less willing to support the kinds of foreign policies that the United States has become accustomed to conducting really for 7 decades, since the beginning of World War I. So I see a major change, not just in the weather, but in the climate of American foreign policy looming just over the horizon.
Mm. Of course, the third part of the big troika in terms of federal spending is defense. I think I'm right in saying that the so-called entitlement programs plus defense constitute something like 75% of the federal budget. And you say also the limits of the possible will be narrower than they have been for many decades. Let me just press you a little bit on that point, in the sense that recently we had Andrew Basevich here. And Andrew, of course, has written a book called Washington Rules America's Path to Perpetual War. And it has seemed that along the way, even though common sense as well as prudence and fiscal responsibility would dictate that we do not get into foreign wars, as it were, and other aspects of aggressive foreign policy, that this hasn't always prevailed. This kind of common sense hasn't always, but that we have continued to borrow. You simply see this as being such a definingly critical time with the entitlement payments factor in particular, that simply a new paradigm is being written as to how we approach this?
Yes, I do. The necessary condition for the kind of foreign policy of which I take it Andy Basevich disapproves, although I haven't read the book, has been an economic basis for foreign policy that permitted these kinds of activities without political strain in the United States, at least without economically induced political strain. The Iraq War became unpopular, and Vietnam was unpopular, and Korea became unpopular because of casualties, principally, not because they were expensive. And indeed, the Iraq War is actually less expensive than those two wars were as a proportion of American GDP. So, but I think it is the boomers' entitlements that changes the picture. Now, some people argue that the Washington system and the American foreign policy system is such that it inevitably produces these interventions, that Uncle Sam is rapaciously interventionist. I don't agree with that, but what I foresee will give us a real test of that hypothesis, because I don't think we're going to engage in these kinds of interventions because the public won't permit them, because they're too expensive. So whether you think Iraq and Afghanistan and the humanitarian interventions of the 1990s in Bosnia, Somalia, and Haiti were good or bad, I think they're just not going to happen anymore in the future for economic reasons. That's a prediction, and that follows quite clearly from my analysis.
Let me turn the question, to ask a corollary question that actually comes at it from a different point of view. We are, after all, the Carnegie Council for Ethics and International Affairs. We're concerned about ethics of foreign policy, ethics of the conduct of foreign policy. Will our constraints, the necessary constraints, which you very convincingly argue, prevent us from carrying out commitments to which we might feel otherwise ethically bound?
I suspect the answer is yes. I don't think we'll see more Bosnias or Somalias or Haitis or Kosovos. There are certainly people who believe that we should be intervening in Sudan. I don't think that's going to happen. We have a president and an administration who, it seems to me, are probably more favorably disposed to this kind of intervention than any we're likely to have in the future, and they're not doing it. Now, there are a number of reasons that they're not intervening in Sudan. We do have 2 wars going on at the moment. Nonetheless, I think the economic constraint looms in the background and will become ever stronger. So that particular area of of ethics and international affairs, and of course, you deal with a whole range of issues, international issues where ethics enter in, but when it comes to military intervention for ethical purposes, I think that's going to be off the table, as it has not been for the last 2 decades.
Interesting. A mischievous question, if I may. What 2 of the two policy decisions that you take to task in the book are, of course, the Iraq War, which you already mentioned, and NATO expansion, in which you and I and a few others were in tandem in the 1990s, one of the great causes of the 1990s. But
and we were right.
And we were right, heaven knows. But the fact of the matter is that not every, essentially you say in the book that the constraints will perhaps have the salubrious effect of preventing some wrong-headed decisions, Iraq being the obvious one. NATO expansion didn't cost a lot of money, but it was still a bad decision. Do you think that every bad decision will be obviated by financial constraints?
Well, that's a good point. What I think that NATO expansion and the Iraq War, and incidentally, I don't mean the decision to go into Iraq per se, which I think was defensible, although in the book you mentioned, The Case for Goliath, I give my reasons that it could be justified, which are not the same as those of the administration. What I'm referring to in the Frugal Superpower is the way the intervention was conducted, and in particular, the complete absence of contingency plans for the aftermath of the deposing of Saddam. The American troops arrived with no plan as to what to do after the Ba'athist regime was vanquished. And what they had in common, I think, was a kind of overconfidence because we were riding high, because we were the sole superpower, because we could do anything and afford anything. I think that we will not in the future feel that sense of confidence, or as I saw it, overconfidence, and overconfidence can breed excess. I'm not sure whether hubris is exactly the right word here, but I think that this post-Cold War overconfidence is what those 2 mistakes had in common. NATO expansion didn't cost a lot of money yet, so it's not the economic constraints per se that will make a difference. It's the sense that the possibilities are not infinite, that we have to make trade-offs, that we have to husband our resources, that we have to decide what is necessary and what is merely desirable. I say at one point that for a number of years, the United States was the billionaire among nations. We decided what we would do, not on the basis of what it cost, but on the basis of whether we thought it was a good thing to do. Now we're sinking back into the middle class, and like middle class people, we can afford to do some things and some important things, and we should do them, but we're going to have to watch our budget in a way that we haven't done certainly in the 2 decades since the Cold War ended. And I would argue, and I make this case in the Frugal Superpower, really since the beginning of World War II. We are going back in some ways to the foreign policy of December 6th, 1941.
Interesting. A couple more questions from here, and then we'll throw it open to the audience. So please have your questions, comments ready. Okay, so we've discussed a little bit both the 3 major factors that will constrain policy, foreign policy. We've talked a little bit about the implications of that. Onto your third point, I can't resist something on the gas dependency thing. The Financial Times, by the way, has a wonderful quote. Mr. Manelbaum has been preaching the gospel of petrol taxes for a long time and does so persuasively. So
I'm glad somebody's been paying attention. You wouldn't know that for all the effect my preaching has had.
Well. clearly this is linked in with what you see as in terms of future threats or challenges. The single most serious one, that is the greater Middle East and so on. And you talk about that our policy challenges there are linked with our dependency on foreign oil. You'd say that keeping gas cheap is basically a failure of political will. You then go on to say that reduced demand from the U.S. And others will reduce the cost of oil and therefore to some extent constrain some of the nefarious influences in the Middle East, reduce capacity for mischief, as it were, and so on, from what I think used to be called states of concern.
Yes.
However, this would imply higher taxes on gasoline in the U.S., a move to smaller cars, the habits of others, including China, in terms of where the price of gas will go. There are all sorts of variables here that at least imply a transitional period to common sense, shall we say. The country doesn't seem to be in a great mood. In fact, the Connecticut political ads at the moment feature that one candidate will raise gasoline prices by 66 cents a gallon. Clearly, the mood of the American public doesn't seem to be headed in your common sense direction.
No, it isn't. I have followed this issue for some time, and as far as I know, no elected politician in the United States has ever agreed with me, has ever agreed that the United States ought to aspire to gasoline prices similar to those that the Europeans and the Japanese pay, and they pay 2.5 to 3 times as much per gallon as we do. 2 points on this. First, obviously the transition away from gasoline is a long one. It's a multi-decade process, but as the saying goes, the journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. And if the United States were to raise the price of gasoline dramatically, this would have 2 effects. One is conservation. We'd use less. Public transport would be more widely used. But second, and most importantly, we would get substitution. We would begin to switch to other sources of power, other fuels, because they would be commercially viable. Ethanol would be viable. The public would demand energy-efficient automobiles. Detroit and Nagoya and other places would start to make them. There would be a lot of investment in battery technology, which means that electrically powered cars would become more feasible. And I believe that the process of innovation will be most productive in the United States. You might say, well, if all this is going to happen, why hasn't it happened in Europe and Japan? And the answer is, I believe that first, their markets are not as big, and second, they don't have the culture of innovation that we do. If anybody's going to build an electric car, it's going to be the United States. Now, the Chinese don't agree, and they're putting a lot of money into electric cars, and I hope ambivalently that they're successful, but I think it really requires the kind of economic ecosystem that the United States has. So you're quite right that if the public were to be wise enough to come to agree with me, and there's certainly no sign of that, we would have a gradual transition, although once American consumption began to decline, it might actually decline rapidly, and although we would still have to import gasoline, it would tilt the balance of power between us and the oil exporters back toward us, and I think would have a political effect. So that's the first point I want to make. The second point is that I believe, although I don't think I go into it in any detail in the Frugal Superpower, I have to reread the books. I haven't read it for a while.
It's worth the read.
Well, that is the message we want to convey. So when I did read it, I remember enjoying it.
You're reviewing your own book, as we discussed before.
Indeed. I believe that the chances are not bad that we will have either a gasoline tax or a broader energy tax, a BTU tax, a carbon tax, in the not too distant future, in the lifetimes of those living, a lifetime of those sitting in this room. And none of us is a teenager, as far as I can tell. For the following reason. I believe that the fiscal condition of the United States is going to become so dire at some point that a new consensus will crystallize first in the political class and then in the country, that something serious and urgent has to be done to reduce the budget deficit. And that will require more revenues. We won't be able to do it politically just by cutting programs. If and when that becomes the consensus, then the question that the country and the Congress will have to confront is not, should we raise taxes, to which the answer is always no, but rather, what taxes should we raise? And if and when that becomes the operative political question, then gasoline taxes in particular and energy taxes in general begin to look not exactly attractive, but less unattractive compared with others than they do now. It looks better to raise consumption taxes for a variety of reasons, I think, than to raise the income tax or the payroll tax, which are the two major sources of federal revenue in the United States. And within the family of consumption taxes or value-added taxes, whatever you want to call them, an energy tax looks less bad than others. You're not going to tax food. You're not going to tax things that Americans make, if you can help it, because that costs jobs. So why not tax something that we import? Well, we import energy. We don't import all energy, and if you want to tax all energy, if you want a carbon tax, you've got to tax coal, and then you've got to deal with the coal lobby. But all of which is to say that my hope and modest expectation is that we will get the kind of policy I call for, although not for the reason that I call for it. It'll come through the back door.
There's always a right moment to open things to the floor, and I think we may have come to that moment. So please, again, please allow my colleague to hold the microphone for you, lady in the...
Susan Gittleson. I think you're really a front door person because you're so sensible, and it's important that people get your message and take it seriously. I read it first, Tom Friedman, who certainly thinks along the lines that you do, and was touting electric cars and everything else.
Or it might be better to say, I think along the lines he does, but in any event, we think alike.
Well, you wrote the book. We'll see. No, but that's the gist of my question is, how can you find more allies who are sensible? And what do you do in our political system where, for example, the Republicans are calling for tax cuts for the rich especially, and greater austerity, but cut out programs, but then what do you do with the people, and so on. So how do you see your ideas playing in the actual political system?
Well, that's a very good question, and I'm afraid I don't have a good answer to it. I could say that that's not my job, that's the job of the politicians. I will say that David and I, for many years, worked on a project that organized annual conferences for members of Congress. These conferences, in my case, were about Russian-American relations, and David was involved in some other conferences as well, so the two of us got to know members of Congress quite well. And to know them is to like them, and generally to be impressed with them. And I found that virtually without exception, when I would raise this issue, the issue of energy taxes and the deficit more broadly, they would agree with me. They understand the situation. They just felt that they couldn't take affirmative action to deal with the problem because it was political suicide. Well, whose fault is that? That's our fault. We have met the enemy, and he is us. We get the kinds of politicians we want. So there is a feeling in the American public that we have an entitlement to get forever more than we pay for. I don't quite know how you change that, and as an academic, as a scholar, I have to admit that I'm at least as interested in the question of why that is as the question of what to do about it. This book is my contribution to doing something about it, and the more people who buy the book and read the book and are persuaded by the book, the greater will be the cadre of right-thinking, sensible people. But having said that, let me go back and reaffirm my original point. You've asked the $64 trillion question, and I don't have the answer. It reminds me of that wonderful line from Joe Kennedy, the patriarch of the Kennedy family. Somebody once said to him, "What's your secret? How did you produce such energetic, resourceful, creative offspring? How did you get such great children?" And Joe Kennedy said, "I don't know what the secret is. If I did, I'd bottle it and sell it." Well, I've tried to write it and sell it, but whether that'll make any difference, I don't know.
Just by way of follow-up, although we resolutely avoid any partisan comment, political comment, there is an article in the Financial Times today that compares the Conservative platform in Britain under Cameron with the Republican campaign statement issued, which basically calls for keeping taxes, keeping the tax cuts, and without severe program cuts. So
Well,
it's clearly an issue.
Yeah,
That's out
so since the British Conservatives have gone in the opposite direction, we should ask somebody who knows the British political system well, why are their conservatives so different from our conservatives? And our liberals aren't great on this subject either. But maybe we could have another such session in which I could interview David.
That sounds like a good idea, although the Conservatives would hardly like me speaking for them. Sir?
Yes. Stephen Blank.
Nor would the English.
No, the English.
We are likely, or at least it's possible, to see a very loud new voice in the U.S. National political spectrum. The final end, I guess, of the post-war Republican Party. What do you see? You must be looking at these people. What do you see as their foreign policy, their foreign policy ideas? What, if we do see this kind of surge of this new populist, it's hard to say right, this new populist voice, what will they put on the table?
Well, it's an interesting question what the Republican foreign policy would be, because the last Republican foreign policy gave us Afghanistan and Iraq, and whatever you think of those policies, the country didn't like them and rejected them. So what would come next, I don't know, and I suspect they don't know. But we do know this, the numbers don't lie. The first chapter of the Frugal Superpower is called The Tyranny of Numbers. There's a difference between what you want to do and what you can do. And the theme of this book, as David elegantly summarized, was that what we can do is going to be narrower no matter which party is in power and no matter who is president. The next president, whoever he or she is, and indeed this president, will have to deal with straightening, that is narrowing, financial circumstances, and will have to make foreign policy on the basis of a narrower range of choices than we have become accustomed to. Now, the rhetoric doesn't reflect that yet, so it's a little difficult to predict what our political leaders will do when reality becomes unavoidable, but I believe it will become unavoidable.
Let me just follow up quickly. What do you think, just in the near term, would be the result of, in the next 6 years, say, of a major election victory of Tea Party types in this election and a defeat of Obama in 2 years? That, the crisis you suggest would not yet be upon us. What do you think these people would do?
I don't know. I don't think they know. What I don't think they do is what they've said they're going to do, because I don't think they'll be able to do it. I don't think that the people running for Congress on the platform that there'll be more tax cuts and no expense cuts are going to be able to do it, because I think that the bond market won't let them get away with it. I think we'll have a dollar crisis, and maybe in this next Congress, if they really try to carry out these policies. You know, there will come a point at which people will flee the dollar for all of its importance. If they calculate, and I think this is, some people say that this is already happening, that people are dumping dollars and going into commodities. If you look at the gap between America's obligations and the amount of money it raises in taxes, and you look at the trajectory of that gap, which is pretty horrifying. I mean, it goes ultimately to 100+% the debt of GDP. I don't think there's any country that we know about that has failed to deal with such a problem by printing money, by inflating the currency. Well, if that happens, you've got a whole different situation in this country and in the world. You don't want to be the Congress or the president responsible for that. But if you don't want to be responsible for that, you got to do something else. And the something else is to raise taxes or cut spending. There are limited options here. And our politicians promise a lot of things, but the clear implication of this book is that they're not going to be able to deliver. What they do when they can't deliver, I don't know.
James Starkman. There are elements of the conservative right in this country which are proposing cutting taxes and cutting spending, and doing it in a way which, for example, a three-tier flat tax, where the so-called rich would be taxed at a high rate, let's say 36%, middle-income people maybe 24%, and low-income people 10 or 12%. And it's been estimated that about $400 billion of presently uncollected taxes under the present system would overnight flow into the Treasury by virtue of the simplicity of a plan of that nature. There are vested interests of tax accountants, tax lawyers, and accountants who would fight such a system. But it would appear to be the right formula for filling the bill. What are your comments on that?
Well, the important hurdle to get over is the acceptance that taxes of some kind are going to have to go up and spending of some kind is going to have to go down. Then you start negotiating. Then the issue is not whether, but how. And then normal politics takes over, which is fine, as long as everybody understands what the end result has to look like. You know, I don't know what the ideal tax system looks like. I don't know what the fairest menu of budget reductions is, and in the end, there's no such thing. You decide these by politics. So you negotiate about these issues, but first you have to agree about what you're negotiating about, and we haven't reached that point yet.
Lydia, second row there.
With the tremendous amount of money that has flowed out of, oh, by the way, my name is Bryn Cohen. With the tremendous amount of money that has been an outflow from this country into China with their manufactured goods, I think initially we had hoped that we were going to maintain the high-tech jobs here. There was an article in the Financial Times last week that spoke to the opposite point of view, that the cheaper manufacturers over there also were finding it extremely convenient to have the high-tech industries next door. And unless we think out of the box, are we going to be left manufacturing anything, or are we just going to be flipping hamburgers?
China's trade policy is a problem. It's a problem for everybody. China pursues a mercantilist trade policy. It keeps its currency artificially low, and there are several efforts underway to deal with that. How that's going to be resolved, I don't know. It's actually not good for China because, and it is a little odd that that a country with hundreds of millions of poor people should be, in effect, subsidizing the consumption of one of the richest countries in the world, namely the United States. All the money that they're lending us could certainly be used for Chinese people to buy things. It's not as if all Chinese are rich and don't need anything. But that is an important international economic problem. Now, it's important to remember, I think, that although China is the world's largest, one of the world's largest exporters, it's a big manufacturing company. In fact, it's not exactly a manufacturing company. It's an assembly plant. It's a packaging company. For all these high-tech products, the products are designed somewhere else, mostly in the United States. And then most of the parts, the expensive, the intricate parts, are made somewhere else. And then they're assembled in China by these young women from the villages. who don't cost very much and who are very reliable, and then they're shipped overseas. If you read the analyses of China's role in the global economy, you will find that for these high-tech products, only about 10% of the purchase price stays in China. Chinese assemble so many, and they're starting from such a low base, that they do very well, and the salaries aren't high. But China is not reaping the main benefits of high-tech industry. It's the designers and the manufacturers of the most important parts. So it's the goal of the Chinese government to be able to move up the value-added chain to do the designing themselves. There's no doubt that the United States has lost manufacturing jobs. On the other hand, that's not necessarily a bad thing if more and more people are gainfully employed and productively employed in service jobs. After all, 100 years ago, 40 or 50% of the American workforce was in agriculture. Now, 2% is in agriculture, but our agriculture is much more productive, and the 48% that used to be in agriculture is doing other things that add more value to the economy. So the rise of China and the rise of India and the rise of low-wage countries that get involved in manufacturing is not per se a bad thing for the United States. It's, in fact, a good thing. But in order to take advantage of this division of labor, American blue-collar workers, or Americans who used to do blue-collar work, have to find other work, and they have to find, in order to move up economically, they have to find jobs that require higher skills, which means that they need better education, which comes back to our educational system, about which I'm happy to say I am not an expert. But so the China problem, and in some ways it is a problem, but it comes back to the American education system.
The gentleman in the pink tie, second row.
My name is Alberto Turlon. I am European. I look at the U.S. foreign policy from an external point of view, and my question is about the values which have driven the American foreign policy in the last century. And we learned that values play a big role in shaping the foreign policy, most notably human rights, democracy. And now that you described this fall from the billionaire from the United States as the billionaire in the world, as in the middle, I hope upper middle class club of countries, will also be the decline of values in the global foreign policy?
Well, American values remain constant. The capacity to act, to implement those values does vary. And as I was saying to David, insofar as one way that values were expressed in American foreign policy was through the kinds of military interventions that we saw in Somalia, in Bosnia, in Haiti, in Kosovo, in Afghanistan, and in Iraq. And let's not forget that although the last two interventions are now not popular in the country, they did remove terrible dictatorships. They did liberate people. So all of those interventions have a claim to furthering American values. But as I was saying to David, I think those interventions are not going to be repeated. So insofar as the expression of American values in American foreign policy depends upon such interventions, there will be less of it.
Nancy Kirk, will there be more interventions on the humanitarian side? In other words, will money, since they're less expensive, will the State Department start getting more money while the Defense Department gets less, and that we won't think only in terms of soldiers conquering land, but taking care of natural disasters, our ex-president's charities, that kind of philanthropy?
Well, that's the plan, but I think that there will be restrictions on foreign spending of all kinds. And remember, when there's a disaster far away, in Indonesia, for example, or even in Haiti, not that far away. The most important issue, the most immediate issue, if you're the president or the president says, do something about this, you're the deputy national security advisor, whoever's in charge of it, the first thing you think about is logistics. How do I get stuff there? How do I get people there? I mean, I can get the stuff, but how do I get it there? You need a lot of transportation. And who has that transportation? You're not going to conscript American Airlines. It's the military.
Sir.
Hi, my name is George Paik. I absolutely agree with your analysis and your identification of key factors. Wondered if we could go the next step. I think some people are reaching in that direction. Are there particular features of the international scene, be they geopolitical or economic or even moral, that we must maintain, that we must have? And what kind of capacity, across all spectrums of capacity, do you think we might have to maintain them? And will our politics, I mean, once we realize there's a decline, how much do we risk losing even the things that we might really need? I wonder if you've given some thought to analysis of that kind of play out.
I'm glad you asked that question, because I wrote 2 chapters on it. I think the 3 most important missions that the United States carries out in the world are its military as well as its diplomatic presence in Europe, East Asia, and the Middle East. In Europe and in East Asia, the United States military presence serves as a kind of buffer between and among countries that are not adversaries but are not altogether comfortable with one another. In Europe, the American presence, which has been greatly reduced since the Cold War but still exists, reassures the Germans and other Western Europeans that if Russia carries out an aggressive foreign policy, the United States will be there to help. But at the same time, it reassures the Russians, who after all were invaded to devastating effect twice in the last century by Germany, that Germany will remain anchored in an American-dominated alliance and therefore will remain benign. Similarly, in East Asia, the American presence reassures the Japanese and others that if China adopts an aggressive foreign policy, the United States will be on the scene for the purposes of deterrence, but at the same time it reassures the Chinese that the Japanese won't conduct an independent military policy. And I think that's worth a lot. It doesn't mean that the withdrawal of the United States will lead immediately to war, but it will lead to heightened uncertainty and therefore suspicion and therefore conceivably arms races and maybe even down the road conflict. It's an insurance policy that I think it's worth having. In the Middle East, the situation is a little different. There is a clearly aggressive country, a country that seeks to dominate the region and its oil resources, evict the United States, overturn countries that are favorable, overturn regimes that are favorable to one, and destroy, commit, in effect, genocide. And that is Iran. The United States is the main deterrent of Iran because none of the countries in the region is willing to or capable of playing that role, with the very partial exception of Israel. But Israel isn't enough. I worry, for example, much more about Iran than North Korea, even though the profiles of the 2 countries are in some ways the same, because North Korea is surrounded by real countries. You know, Japan, South Korea, China, these are real, strong, coherent nation states that are capable of acting for themselves. It's not true in the Middle East. The oil sheikdoms are not capable of defending themselves, and therefore we have to do the job. And I do worry that the coming political climate, driven by the coming economic climate in the United States, will reduce the willingness and the ability of the United States to play the necessary role in checking Iran. And that is connected with my policy prescription for higher gasoline taxes, because I think the most important thing we can do for the Middle East, from our point of view, is make it less important. The last 2 administrations have tried, each in a different way, to reform the Middle East. The Clinton administration had the Arab-Israeli peace process. The Bush administration had the democratization of Iraq. Maybe both of them will work someday, but they're not working now. So I think that our policy ought to be based on the realization that we're not going to change the Middle East fundamentally, and that we therefore should reduce our exposure to it, and our exposure depends almost entirely on oil.
Thank you, William Verdone. In keeping the thread of oil and what you said about the dollar and now commodities, probably the favorable place, there is a concept, and there might be an elephant in the back of the room, there's a concept called peak oil, which means that, and I guess you've heard of that.
Sure.
Within the next 10 to 12 years, all the oil that's retrievable has been retrieved. And therefore, for example, the tar sands in Alberta, where you take $1 to refine and sell, brings you only 15 cents at the cash register, is no longer cost effective. That concept can drastically alter the Middle East. I wonder if you can comment on that.
Yeah, peak oil is a concept that, well, it's based on the truism. There's only a finite amount of oil in the world, and we're past the peak. We've got more than half of it, and it's going to be increasingly difficult and therefore increasingly expensive to get oil. I don't know whether it's right. I mean, it's surely right in some sense. That is, there is only a finite amount of petroleum under the Earth's surface. And I think it is a pretty safe bet that the price of oil is going to go up, partly because although there's still lots of oil left, it does become harder to get at, partly for political reasons, because OPEC has an incentive to keep energy expensive and has not invested a lot in oil exploration. And most of the known reserves of oil are owned by governments. You know, Exxon can't just go out and explore. You can say, well, if there's oil out there and if it's going to be expensive, Exxon can always raise money to drill. That's true, but where most of the oil is, they can't get political permission to drill. And in addition, the price of oil is likely to go up because demand will increase because the Chinese and to a lesser extent the Indians are buying cars. So whether or not you subscribe to a particular iteration of the peak oil theory, I think it is not hard to conclude that the price of oil is going to go up, that there's a secular trend. Now, the price of oil always zigzags, and that undercuts efforts to conserve relying purely on the price of oil. The price of oil skyrocketed in the 70s because of the two oil crises, and then it went down again, and so many of the gains were given back. People had been buying fuel-efficient cars. Then when the real price of oil went down, they began buying SUVs. So now we got a whole fleet of SUVs. So I conclude two things. First of all, the price of oil over time is going to go up, and that's a bad thing for us economically and especially politically. And second, we would be better off economically and politically if rather than simply letting nature or politics take its course, we artificially intervene to raise the price of oil, or at least put a floor under it, so that we would get the appropriate responses. We need a price signal where oil is concerned, and only government can give a strong enough price signal.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Jim Gannon with the Japan Center for International Exchange. In the political climate of scarcity that you described, I assume, where there'll be less tolerance for overseas commitments, it seems you would have a situation where it's a lot easier to mobilize funding politically for crises rather than far-sighted interventions, more money for disaster relief than for ARVs. And so it seems you would have a foreign policy that's more reactive, more crisis-driven, less judicious. Now, if I got Dr. Speedy right at the beginning, he paraphrased your argument that in the future U.S. foreign policy would, or U.S. would pick and choose more judiciously among its foreign policy commitments. I assume that is a normative argument. How do you square the two, first of all? And second, do you have confidence that our political institutions are sufficient for us to be able to be picking judiciously amongst our commitments? in the future?
Well, I'm not sure I understand your question, but I will answer what I take to be your question. I think that the political system will have to respond to the new economic circumstances. I hope it will respond judiciously. I don't know that it will. I can't predict the future, obviously. You make an important point. Foreign policy tends to be reactive and crisis-driven, and policy tends to be crisis-driven. And I think it is true that a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. And we wasted 9/11 in retrospect, in that was the time to raise gasoline prices, and we could have done it then. That raises the question of how the signal that our economic circumstances has changed dramatically will be transmitted to the American public. And I think there's every chance that there will be an economic crisis like September 15, 2008. I think there's every chance of a dollar crisis where people start to flee the dollar, interest rates skyrocket, we fall into a deep recession, and suddenly people say, oh my God, what do we do? And if there's another deep recession, we don't have the resources for deficit spending. I mean, we're not going to be able to borrow as many dollars. So it may be that it will take an economic crack-up to persuade the country that we can't continue on this course. But I'm convinced that something will happen to persuade the country of that point. And in the book, I lay out what I think are the appropriate responses. Whether they will be the actual responses, I'm not sure. But one of the reasons that I wrote the book was to make the case that this is what the country should do in these coming circumstances.
Last from the floor from Devin Stewart.
Hi, Devin Stewart, Carnegie Council and former student, Professor Manelbaum. Good to see you. Are you worried about conflict relating to resource scarcity around energy? One related question. And another related question is, are you worried about the downside of possible instability in the Middle East if demand for oil does decline? Some analysts have brought up this as a scenario.
Well, as one would expect from a former Sci student, those are two excellent questions. Competition for resources. In theory, it shouldn't happen. In theory, the Chinese shouldn't be worried about locking down secure supplies of oil because oil is a globally traded commodity. It's fungible. But that's not how the Chinese are responding. Not only that, the Chinese seem to be, or at least some believe that the Chinese are worried enough about the security of their supplies of oil to build a blue water navy, which would inevitably challenge that of the United States. So I think it's not difficult to sketch out a scenario in which competition for resources, especially oil, could lead, not rationally, not necessarily, but in some ways irrationally, to conflict. And this is the point at which one reminds one's readers, as I do in the book, that one of the causes of World War I was the Anglo-German naval rivalry. That is yet another reason to reduce the world's dependence on oil, because it is a conceivable cause of Sino-American conflict. Now, as for the possibility that oil revenue, that a decline in oil revenues will destabilize regimes in the Middle East that depend on them, well, very good point. In at least one case, that's what we want. We want the Iranian regime to fall. We want it to go away. We don't want it to have resources to buy enough to support and to pay its goon squads to stay in power. So if that, in the Iranian case, that would be a good thing. In the case of the Saudis, the Kuwaitis, there are two possibilities. One is they would have to reform and have a real economy in order to pick up the slack if they got less money from oil. Or there might be political instability there, but if we depended less on oil, it wouldn't matter as much. And anyway, I think it would be a worthwhile price to pay.
Michael, I can't resist closing by asking you to broaden things just a little bit, and in do so I quote your aforementioned good friend Tom Friedman, who in a recent column in the Times, it was titled, "We Are Number 11." you may have read this. In this, Tom Friedman contrasts the Great Generation, the challenges they faced, the Depression, Nazism, Soviet communism, the great challenges and the sacrifices that they were willing to make. He contrasts that with our shared baby boomer generation, the problems that are listed. But our generation's leaders never utter the word sacrifice. All solutions must be painless. Which drug would you like? A stimulus from Democrats or a tax cut from Republicans? A national energy policy? Too hard, says Tom, et cetera, et cetera. And he concludes by saying, our leadership message to the world, except for our brave soldiers, seems to be after you. I assume you probably don't necessarily agree 100% with your friend on this, or?
I'm not sure how I would disagree. Alas, I fear that's right.
Even the after you part?
Well, that I think is probably a reference, or could be a reference, to the motto of the Israeli army. The Israeli commanders always lead from the front, and their motto is after me. You never do anything, you never ask your subordinates to do anything that you are not willing to do. You put yourself in harm's way. And I think our motto is one that was expressed long ago by a now deceased and possibly forgotten chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, which is the tax writing committee, Russell Long of Louisiana, who said that the average American's view of taxes is expressed in a ditty that he made up, which is, don't tax you, don't tax me, tax that fellow behind the tree. Well, like the Wizard of Oz, there's no one behind the tree.
A nice coda. The book is The Frugal Superpower. I just noticed actually from here, Michael, the cover displays a rather shabby-looking American flag-style wallet with $2 protruding from it. I assume that's not quite how you see our parsimonious state of affairs.
Well, I have to say that when the cover was first designed, it's a brilliant design by the public affairs designer. It was that design, but the wallet looked spiffier. And I said, no, it has to look battered.
Well, it certainly does. The book is available, and now I ask you to join me in thanking the author very much for being with us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michael.